Hello, my name's Kieron. I'm Security Platform Team Lead at Phoenix.
Hi there, I'm Jon Hope, Senior Technology Evangelist at Sophos.
So Jon, we're here today to talk about the State of Ransomware Report. If someone hasn't heard of that, what exactly is the State of Ransomware Report?
Okay, so the State of Ransomware Report is a bit of a staple in the Sophos calendar now. It's in its 6th year, and it's our research into how customers and end users are experiencing the world of cybersecurity and cyber threats. So we interview a random selection of organisations from all over the world, different organisation sizes, different organisation types, really to get a feel for how they're experiencing cyber threats. It's a really, really great insight into what they're experiencing, the challenges that they face, and how it affects organisations. So this year we've got data from 3,400 organisations that have been selected at random to give us a flavour of cyber threats, and we've asked them a number of questions. It's worth mentioning that these organisations are not necessarily Sophos customers. The survey itself is conducted by a third party at random, so that we're not biasing the output of those results at all.
So what a lot of organisations want to know, Jon, is why do organisations get hit and how do they get hit? Does the State of Ransomware Report give us anything in that?
Absolutely, it's one of the first questions that we ask actually, is to understand a bit more about the both operational and technical reasons behind how organisations fall foul of ransomware and other forms of cybercrime. It's not necessarily as clear cut as you might think actually. So if we look at the top reasons associated with why organisations get hit from a technical perspective, they're actually all a combination of both technology and people challenges as well. So for the 5th year running, exploited vulnerabilities are still the largest underlying reason why organisations get hit by ransomware and how do cyber criminals get in. And on the face of it, you would think that's a technology challenge, and to an extent it is. It's really important that organisations update their software, they patch, they remove legacy systems from production. But it does actually have a people element to it as well, because most organisations know that they should be patching, but often those patching exercises get overlooked simply because organisations either don't have the time or the technical expertise in order to conduct those patching operations successfully. But then when you start looking a little bit lower down in terms of the slightly less common reasons for attack, most of these are people challenges in one way, shape or form. So the second most likely reason for organisations to get hit is actually through compromised credentials. So this is where organisations have had usernames and passwords stolen, or the cyber criminals are impersonating user accounts. So that is obviously a people problem, because that's pure social engineering. Then the next two reasons are somewhat overlap. You've got compromised emails and phishing, and what this is all talking about really is that human element. Again, phishing is manipulating humans to carry out different actions, and malicious emails in themselves are not going to be malicious typically unless you actually interact with them in some way. So what we can learn very quickly is that there's a pretty even spread of around 4 different factors, but they're all a combination of technology and I said in a lot of cases actually people-related issues.
So Jon, you mentioned technology challenges as well as human elements of challenges, but what about operational challenges within an organisation?
Okay, so that's a question that we've asked for the first time in the latest State of Ransomware Report, is looking at organisational challenges as well as the technology challenges. And what we see here is a distinct split between 3 different operational challenges. The first being a challenge with protection. So most organisations have invested something in cybersecurity. It's very unusual that organisations get hit because they've not bought any kind of technology. But when we look at protection challenges, what we're really talking about here is either solutions that have been in place but are not adequate, they're not up to the job, or that those solutions have been put in place and they're not configured properly, which is surprisingly common, or that organisations have missed certain elements or failing to cover all the bases. Then you've got resource challenges, and this is something which I'm pretty sure everybody listening to the video could empathise with. This is where organisations just simply don't have either the skills or the time, or a combination of being able to apply those skills around the clock to cover all of the different challenges. So cybersecurity is not easy, and it's not getting any easier, particularly when we start looking at human-led threat hunting and the fact that we now have to counter active cyber criminals hands on keyboard. You need to have somebody at the other end constantly with skills to be able to defend organisations, and that's a really significant challenge. We've also then got security gaps, and this is an area which is increasingly commonplace. There's a huge different number of things you have to consider with cybersecurity. You've got the basics of endpoint protection, you've got then firewalls that people are all quite accustomed to, but then there are so many new fields. There are things like, how do you protect public cloud, how do you protect your mobile devices, and increasingly, how do you look at your estate and identify devices that are unmanaged, that are within your estate, and we'll look at that in a little while when we look at some of the more unpleasant effects of ransomware, and looking at root causes that are associated to unprotected devices, unmanaged devices. So having those gaps in place, sometimes organisations accept that they have gaps and they just simply can't afford to cover them all, but in many cases the attacks that organisations experience actually then expose the weaknesses that maybe they'd never even considered before. We actually find as well that organisations continuously cite more than one of these things. So again, it's not just a case of one of these elements. The average response was 2.7 of these factors. So you get this idea that there's a pretty even split between all these different factors that are all in play at the same time. So if we look at poorly configured solutions, for example, this is one of the reasons why we conduct the health checks, is to make sure that customers who are running Sophos products are getting the most out of their product by making sure it's set up properly. And it's also worth mentioning that we're going to talk about remote ransomware in a short while as one of the common attack vectors, and we're a vendor that helps to protect against those particular issues. When it comes to the skills factor, this is really where cybersecurity as a service comes into play to help organisations get over those skills shortages. And when it comes to giving organisations time back to help them do things like patching more effectively, this is where looking at cybersecurity as a platform kind of inherently gives organisations time back, because the solutions are easier to manage. They often coordinate their defences when you look at it from a platform perspective. So there's lots of things that help within the Sophos portfolio against the challenges that we've just talked about.
So when an organisation's been hit, what typically happens with the data?
So in almost every case, the cybercriminal objectives are to encrypt data. The whole purpose of almost every version of ransomware in some way, shape or form is to deny access to the victim organisation of the data by encrypting it, so that they really don't have any choice but to pay the cybercriminals off. Globally, 50% of ransomware attacks involve successful encryption of data, but actually in the UK, one of the things that really made our region stand out is the fact that 70% of ransomware attacks involve successful encryption of data. And what this tells us is most cybersecurity solutions are obviously not able to protect against that attack vector. It means that in 70% of cases, all of that investment in cyber is just not cutting it, and it's not really effectively protected the organisation. And again, we'll explore some of the reasons behind that in a second. One of the other things that we're monitoring very closely is a bit of an outlying type of an attack, but it is increasingly common, and that is the concept of hitting an organisation and holding them to ransom without actually encrypting their data. And we've seen that shift from 2024 to 3% of attacks, now up to 6%. So this is where the cyber criminals maybe have just simply stolen data and then are threatening to publicise that or leak it or sell it in some way, and that in itself is a new version of attack. And obviously, if cyber criminals can avoid the aggravation of having to encrypt data in the first place and still extort money out of victims, that's going to be an easier path. So that's an attack vector that we're watching with increasing interest. It is also significantly more difficult to detect that form of attack. Obviously, if you log in one day and you see encryption across your file system and you see ransom notes popping up, you know you've been hit. But if your data's been stolen, unless you're actually looking to see what's left your organisation, it can be pretty hard to tell that that's actually happened until you get the bad news of some sort of ransom demand.
Ransomware has been around for quite a while now, John, but why are we still seeing 70% of attacks that still including successful encryption?
It's a great question, and it's really down to the methodology that cyber criminals are deploying. They've discovered that there is a weak spot in a lot of cybersecurity solutions, which is, I've already mentioned, remote ransomware. So let's explain a little bit about what that is. So first of all, remote ransomware involves the exploitation of a device on a victim's estate that is either unprotected or maybe isn't configured properly or is underprotected. And that's surprisingly commonplace. So if you think about a network of any sort of scale, there are bound to be devices on the estate somewhere that just don't have coverage. And that can either be because the administrators overlooked them, or simply that they cannot have any kind of protection in place. So if you think about niche environments like manufacturing, there might be machine tools that the operators have said, the owners of those machines have said you can't put software on them. If you think about hospitals, then you might be looking at devices like MRI scanners that you just can't deploy software on. And that is in itself a bit of an opportunity. If you even think about more mundane environments like schools, then they will have things like printers, like CCTV systems that, believe it or not, can be used as an attack vector. And once the cyber criminals find something which is unprotected, that's their in. What they're actually trying to do is not necessarily attack that device itself, but use it as a bridgehead to launch attacks against other devices in the estate. So this is how remote ransomware plays out. The cybercriminals will find that device, they will use it to then launch encryption commands against data that is sitting somewhere else in the estate. So kind of typically your servers, where all the interesting data is secured. And this exposes, as I've already mentioned, a weak spot that exists in most cybersecurity solutions, where they are typically looking for malicious code being executed actually on the device that they're protecting. They're not so interested in commands that are coming around from external sources. And what often happens is you've got your endpoint protection software running, and these encryption commands are coming in, and the endpoint protection doesn't see any problems because it's not seeing malicious code execution actually on the device itself. We do something slightly different. So our endpoint protection has a really nice feature in it called Crypto Guard, which is really looking at the state of data and interrupting any write requests to files that already exist, so that we can take a moment just to check to see what we had to start with and what we have as a result of a write attempt. So let me paint you two scenarios. One is I'm making a PowerPoint presentation, which is something I do all the time. I decided that I want to change the shade of blue. Then what happens is PowerPoint is going to write to that file, and we're going to read the existing file, write something down to it, and what our endpoint protection does, it takes a little snapshot of before and after. And what we see there is the file itself has changed in some way. So we've gone from one shade of blue to another, which has changed the binary data, but it's still PowerPoint, it still has structure, it still has order. Now let's take a different scenario. And now instead of me changing the colours, we've actually got a cyber criminal in the estate, and they're trying to mess up all the data and jumble it up. What happens there is we start with structured data, and we end up with this whole jumbled up mess of encrypted data. And what we're looking for actively is something called entropy. It's basically a measurement of the randomness of a file. And when you use that methodology, it's really easy to see when you go from structure to chaos that something is quite catastrophically gone wrong with that particular file. And we use this for two things. One is we can convict processes, or in this case of remote ransomware, other devices in the estate that are doing bad stuff. But if you remember, we kept a snapshot so that we could do a comparison. Well, that snapshot becomes our get out of jail free card, because now we can restore that snapshot back to its original place. So just purely through that functionality, we're able to cover this gap of remote ransomware, which so many cyber criminals will utilize. And that's why we still see such a high volume of successful encryption attacks, because this is an attack vector which many cyber criminals will exploit. And interestingly, as I said, it's an increasingly common part of the cyber criminal toolkit. If you look at Microsoft's own data, they'll tell you that 60% of attacks involve the encryption of data. We think it's more like 80%, but it doesn't really matter what statistic you want to pull on. Basically, this is a big part of the cyber criminal toolkit. And again, it's worth emphasizing, almost every cybersecurity vendor in the endpoint space has no defense against this. So it's a really common loophole that cyber criminals will use.
So John, when an organisation does get hit, how would they go about getting their data back, and how would they remediate? How should they pay the ransom?
Okay, let's break that down into two questions. How should they recover and how should they remediate? First of all, in an ideal world, they should have a backup. In fact, we advocate the 3-2-1 process of backups. So 3 backups, 2 of which on site, 1 of which off site or taken offline in some way to keep the organisation secure. And it's 2025, and everybody knows they should be backing up. But one of the really interesting trends that we've watched over the years with the State of Ransomware Report is the reduction in the successful use of backups as a recovery mechanism. In the latest report, 54% of organisations used a backup to successfully restore data, and that's now at a 6-year low. And that really surprises me because, as I said, it's 2025 and people should be aware that backups are an important strategy. Having said that, the cyber criminals will actively go after backups. And it's a very common attack vector. In fact, it's probably one of the first things the cyber criminals go to try and find is they will destroy your backups or they'll disable backups. And we'll talk about some of the clever and insidious methods maybe a bit later on that they use to get at your backups. But they do that because obviously you're not typically going to pay the ransom if you've got a good backup to restore from. Your next question was, should organisations pay the ransom? And it's really easy to say in a nice, calm office environment that we shouldn't pay the cyber criminals off. In an ideal world, we shouldn't, because we're actually perpetuating the problem to an extent if we continue to pay the cyber criminals. It's obviously going to encourage more people into this industry, and I do kind of deliberately call it an industry. If they still see successful payout, that's your first problem. So there's this kind of social, moral, ethical argument about, should you pay the criminals off? And ideally you shouldn't. But having said that, if you're in a factory and the machines aren't working, or you're in a hospital, maybe more critically, and doctors can't access patient records because the data's been encrypted, then those lines become quite blurred. So it's not an easy decision to make. What I would say is that it is not necessarily a particularly good return on investment. So there are some outlying gangs that have really no intention of giving your data back, but they're quite fly-by-night even by cyber criminal standards, and they typically don't last very long because as a business model it falls apart quite quickly. If word gets out that you pay the criminals and you just don't get your data back anyway, then people aren't going to pay the ransom. So most cybercrime gangs genuinely want to give you your data back, but they will invest an awful lot more effort in getting in and encrypting data versus the investment they're making in the tools to put things right again afterwards. You will typically get about half of your data back if you pay the cyber criminals off, and it is by no means a silver bullet that just solves all your problems. The data is going to be messed up, it's not going to be in the same format it started out in, and let's face it, would you trust that data anyway after it's been through the cyber criminal machine? So it's not great from that perspective, but I'll reserve moral judgment because it's not an easy situation. It's a very stressful situation to be in.
And what type of techniques do they use?
Okay, well the first thing to understand is that the media image that you typically see of a teenager in a hoodie hanging out in mum and pop's basement, that isn't the reality of cybercrime. These are very highly organised and very well structured gangs, and one of the things they have at their disposal is this huge quantity of human resources, and this is one of the reasons why going out and just simply buying security technology and expecting you to be covered isn't really a sustainable approach, because in most of the successful attacks, you're actually dealing with a human at the other end. And the reality is that humans are very smart, we innovate, we try different things, we're inherently unpredictable. And what it means is that technology on its own is not going to cover you in the vast majority of these cases, particularly when you look at some of the techniques the cyber criminals will use. So we increasingly see the cyber criminals doing things like using compromised credentials. It's incredibly difficult to tell the difference between a user logging in legitimately versus that credential set being stolen and then being used against the organisation. Technology is not going to be able to figure out the difference between the two, for example. And then we also see a common attack vector of what's broadly called living off the land. This is where the cyber criminals will use legitimate IT tools against an organisation. And again, if you look at things like PowerShell, like RDP and remote desktop type tools, help desk tools as well, another good example. These are all used by organisations legitimately to help them service their own staff and keep devices up and running, particularly when the IT desk might be in a completely different place to where the users are. But that same level and power of remote access can very easily be used by the cyber criminals to then conduct malicious activities. And again, how can technology ever differentiate between users doing the right things and that same set of tools being used against an organisation? And this presents organisations, once they understand that risk, with this kind of huge challenge of being obliged to use these tools and then knowing that at any moment they could be used against an organisation. And this is really where human-led threat hunting has to take over, because one thing that humans can do really well is we can put context around things. We can look at events that might be suspicious, and we can rationalise whether this is legitimate behaviour or if this is something we need to investigate in more detail. When we conduct threat investigations, as part of our incident response engagements, we can always see warning signs. There are always things where the crims get in, they start leaking data out of the organisation, they escalate privileges, they become the administrator, they destroy your backups, and then eventually they launch ransomware. We don't just see ransomware popping out of nowhere. There are always trails of breadcrumbs along the way. And this is really where the actual fight of cybersecurity is these days. It's being able to detect those telltale signs, which on their own are not going to trigger off antivirus alerts and malware alerts. But when you piece the chain together, you can see that this is an attack which is about to take place. The typical dwell time in attacks is still actually around 5 days. So you have got a pretty decent window of opportunity from when the cybercriminals first get in to spot these things before it gets really bad and things really go pear-shaped. So one way an organisation can effectively do threat hunting is to have a cybersecurity team. And even then it's not easy, because if you think about a typical office environment, there's heaps of data being generated in log files. Every endpoint, every server, every switch, every access point, every firewall, every router, everything's generating logs, and you might just get a couple of little glimpses somewhere along the way that something's going to be going astray. And this is where tools like EDR and XDR come into play, because you can start to do threat hunts. The problem is, no matter how easy we try to make EDR and XDR, then it's a quite complex discipline. You've got to be a skilled cybersecurity professional, really, to fully understand what these tools are telling you. Going out and buying tools on its own and expecting you to become the greatest threat hunter in the world is unrealistic. It'd be like me going to the local sports goods shop and buying a set of boxing gloves and expecting to become a fighter overnight. Tools is one thing, but the ability to use them is something else. And this is why we talk a lot about things like MDR as the countermeasure to these kind of attacks, is where we actually then start to deploy real cybersecurity experts on behalf of an organisation, looking at that same telemetry, but this time, instead of with the best will in the world, an amateur looking at it, you've actually now got skilled cybersecurity professionals who just do this day in and day out. And we finely tune the system so that where these interesting events occur, we get them in front of a human analyst as fast as possible. It usually takes about a minute to go from an interesting event through to an analyst actually looking at it, and again, bringing that power of human rationalization and contextualization to work out whether this is an actual problem. And then what we do about it next. And this is really where the value of these kind of MDR services come into play, because first of all, you've got eyes on 24 hours a day, but then we're really quickly getting to the point where we know that we need to do something about it. And we get sources of telemetry from just so many interesting places. So we have an open architecture that allows us to bring in data from places like your Microsoft estate. If you look at a business email compromise attack, you might have the cybercriminals getting in, impersonating one of your users, and then simply redirecting anything that has an email with order or invoice type language inside it, and then very easily conning the organisation out of money just by subtly changing the bank details and sending them back to the original recipient, so that somebody in accounts payable is just merrily paying the cyber criminals rather than the actual legitimate suppliers. That's a really good example of an attack that is never going to trigger a virus alert. It's not hacking. There's nothing going on there other than business process being compromised. If we get interesting redirect rules being generated, that's case creating, and we start making phone calls and finding out if those are legitimate things or not. Another really good example, I talked about backups. Remember I said that backups are one of the first things that cybercriminals will go after. If we see odd activity from the backup partners that we integrate with, so Veeam and Rubrik is a couple of examples. If we see things like administration passwords being changed, or we see changes to the scope of backups, or we see backups being deleted, these again are all case creating events, and we really like those integrations because it's almost like a canary in the coal mine. It's the thing that tells us that the organisation is about to become a victim, because it's typically one of the first things that the cybercriminals will go after. And again, if you look at the way those attacks unfold, if the cybercriminals have simply impersonated the administrator and changed the passwords to lock you out of that, then unless you've actually actively tried to log in, you probably wouldn't notice that, and you'll still get your email every day saying backup complete, backup complete, backup complete. And it's only when you go to try and restore from the backup you realise that actually you were locked out of that all the time, and that backup actually has no value to it at all. So this again is a really good indication of where you get the kind of maximum value out of looking at the estate, and have those expert eyes looking for those interesting events.
Before we wrap up, Jon, how does a human operated service scale, and what can you learn from attacks that benefits everyone?
So those questions are somewhat linked together. One of the challenges of standing up a cybersecurity solution of this nature is finding enough humans that have those skill sets that are required to be able to perform threat hunting. It's well documented that there aren't enough threat analysts out there, so we have to use the analyst time that we've got very effectively. And one of the ways that we do that is everything's powered by AI these days. We use a lot of AI and machine learning type technologies to filter out all of the noise and really just get to the interesting events and maximize the analyst time by getting those interesting events to them as fast as possible. We also spend a lot of effort in consolidating alerts. So remember that I said we will take telemetry from a lot of different sources, so not just endpoints but firewalls from NDR appliances and so on and so forth. If you look at an attack from a helicopter view, then all of these data points actually, they all merge into one, and we try to replicate the way a human analyst would look at an attack and piece the bits together, so that when we present it to an analyst, instead of giving them 200 alerts from just the email, we're basically saying here is one event and these are the vectors and things that you need to be aware of, so that they can very quickly get to the point, instead of just filtering through a load of alerts and basically playing alert whack-a-mole, we can get straight down to here's an incident. One of the other challenges around scale is that if you think about it from a worldwide perspective, the cyber criminals are not just hitting one organisation at a time. These attacks are happening all over the place, and it's a terrible waste of analyst time to keep investigating the same attacks in different organisations. So we try to operate this kind of wisdom of crowds approach, where everything we learn from one investigation we can then take forward and actually start to make our products better and start to build in automation, so that the real objective is not to have the same analyst looking at the same attack more than once. So let me give you an example of that. So we currently have around 33,000 organisations using our service, and what it means is we go through this kind of loop of investigation multiple times a day, and we actually industrialise the process of taking what in the industry we call IOCs and TTPs, basically the signs of an attack and the techniques the cyber criminals use. We extract that information, and actually we basically walk it back to Sophos labs that make our product. So when we see a new type of attack, then we try to build it into a product to protect it at a technology level as quickly as we can. So if we investigated a phishing attack today in Peru, then about 45 minutes later, the things that are important and unique about that attack, like the source email addresses, the web addresses it's trying to get you to click on, the attachment types and those kind of things, we will feed that information into our product, and it takes about 45 minutes for then Sophos email to be protecting against the attack, which means next time around it's not even getting in front of an analyst because it's been blocked at a technology level. And we really make a lot of effort into doing this. We actually spend about a third of engineering time actually just kind of building it back into the product. And the really cool thing is, because we take telemetry from so many different sources, we're not just learning from Sophos products, but also from all these other integrations as well. And it means that we're constantly improving and constantly making the organisation as lean as possible, so we can support so many organisations effectively, again, by maximising the analyst time. This is one of the things that kind of stands us apart from local MSPs, that they only have a view of their customers. We have this global view, organisations of all different sizes all over the world, and it's when you buy MDR, it's kind of almost like buying into this cybersecurity club in which everybody benefits. You can see, like I said, how an attack in one part of the world actually can improve protection everywhere within a relatively short space of time. So it's really the only way we're going to win this kind of battle of cybersecurity. If you look at the cybercrime gangs, one of the things I didn't mention is, of course, they learn from each other internally, but they also learn from other gangs, and they share data and share information. And if we're going to beat them, we have to be just as organised and learn from each other and help to operate this kind of herd protection if we're really going to win the battle of cybersecurity. And
when you touched on the AI piece earlier on, that relates very nicely to episode 1, which happened with yourself and Sally a couple a couple of months ago. So if you haven't seen that, please go check that out. But thank you very much everyone for watching, we really appreciate it. There will be a link to look at the State of Ransomware Report should you wish to. And thank you, John, for your time, it's been much appreciated.
It's always a pleasure, no problem at all.